Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. And welcome to part 2 of our conversation with John Powell. Now joining us from San Francisco to get his take on the recent events in Ferguson is John Powell. He's a professor of law and professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Powell is also the director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. Thanks for being with us again, John.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for having me.
So, John, I wanted to talk to you about the role of the police and the courts, even before the incident that took place between the police officer and Michael Brown in Ferguson. What was that relationship like?
Well, it was a very disturbing relationship. It was a low-grade harassment, and there's a study out that shows this. Ferguson is a small town. It has 8,000 households. Last year, they had more than 12,000 warrant cases on Ferguson's, and more than 24,000 warrants being issued. And most of them were directed at the Black community. So if you're Black in Ferguson, you're likely to be stopped by the police, you're more likely to be searched, you're more likely to be issued a warrant than your white counterpart. And the thing that's interesting is that when they do the searches, they actually find contraband more often on white people than on Black people. And yet Black people are being stopped, they're being searched, and they're being fined. And they're using this partially just to fund the town. The second largest source of revenue is from these fines. So they're actually milking over $2 million. A town of 21,000 people have come from these fines last year. And so the Black community felt like the police are not there to protect them, that they're basically to police them and to extract money off of them. And the courts actually participate in this. So it's really a system that's not just, again, hostile in Ferguson, but we see a similar system operating through much of the United States. Only recently, there was a ruling that throughout the United States, many prisons would charge as much as $17 a minute for a call for inmates, $17 a minute. And recently, the federal government actually stopped that practice. So we're using the criminal justice system not only to harass people and police people, but also to extract resources from the community.
And I mean, in the case of the prisons, are we seeing more of these policies as more and more prisons become privatized?
Yes. It's problematic on so many different levels. Yes, we're privatizing prisons. We only had 5 private prisons 20 years ago. Now we have over 100, hundreds of thousands of prisoners being incarcerated, and ways of making money. We're also locating many of these prisons, not in the Black community where a disproportionate number of inmates come from, but in the rural white community as a way of creating jobs and as a way of creating political clout. Because the prisoners count for apportionment, for voting apportionment, but they don't get their chance to vote. It reminds us of the 3/5 clause when Black slaves used to count for the portions of House of Representatives in apportionment, but they didn't get the right to vote. We're seeing the same system in place throughout the United States, only worse, because instead of 3/5, they count as a full person for the point of giving more political clout to rural white areas as well as jobs.
Break that down for me, John, because that's very interesting. So give me an example.
So the number of congressmen you have in any congresspeople you have in any area depend on the number of people who live in the area. And so the more people, the more representatives you get. That's also used to decide how many electors you get in the electoral college in the vote for the president. So it's actually quite important. So you want as many people and as many electorates and as many congresspeople as possible. So if you take the home of prisoners, inmates, as where they're housed, then since they're housed in majority white rural areas, it increased the voting power, the population count for those communities. So they get an extra congressperson, which means also to get extra weight in terms of electing the president. And the Black people are counted for the purpose of increasing the number, but they're not allowed to vote. Only 2 states allow people who are incarcerated to vote while they're incarcerated. So we count them for the purpose of increasing the number, but it doesn't benefit them. It benefits the white community that they're housed in.
Which 2 states are those that allow prisoners to vote?
Rhode Island and Maine, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, all right.
because I have very small Black populations.
Okay. John, I really wanted to have you back on the program. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.